Good day to you. You know, we've had 12 classes so far and we've covered a lot of material in this class. One of the areas of material that we've covered has to do with criticizing the media. And did you know that I'm teaching a class in the spring semester called Media Criticism that you may be interested in? It's a 3-week class. Yeah, in the spring semester. The middle week is over spring break, and the other 2 weeks are the week before it and the week after. It's a 3-week class. It's called Media Criticism, CMST 348, where we take a look at analyzing media from a bunch of perspectives to understand how media help us to think, believe, and feel. So we've talked about that in this class. We've also talked somewhat about social media in this class. Did you know that I'm teaching a class in the spring called Critical Perspectives on Social Media Use, CMST 340? It's all online, just like the media criticism classes that I'm teaching. Another area that we've talked about in this class so far has been looking at media from around the world under our global media lecture. Did you know that I'm teaching a class called Comparative Media, and I'm teaching it in Sweden this summer? It's a 3-week class. 2 weeks will be in the beautiful town of Malmo, Sweden. You're welcome to take that class. You're welcome to take any of those 3 classes. And by now at this point in the lecture, you're probably saying, all right, enough self-promotion. Why are you starting classes that way? I'm starting classes this way, because I want to illustrate the dilemma of public relations. The dilemma of public relations is, when do you start to cross over from providing useful information about the image of the entity that's providing information, in this case myself, when do you cross over from that over into self-promotion, advertising, and even at the government level, propaganda? When does that happen? That's what public relations faces, and that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on our 13th chapter, which is public relations. And by the way, everything I told you about in the beginning of this instructor video is true, and you're welcome to take any of those classes with me. And yes, it is totally legitimate for a professor to let students know who are in his class right now about another class that they're teaching. And something else I might mention is I'm retiring on June the 30th as well. So those will be the last chances to take classes with me. That's legitimate, but when does it become too much? When does it encroach on the space of an intro to mass media class? That's what we're going to try and sort out today as we take on this area of mass media, which is an area that has and still continues to face a public relations problem with itself, if you want to think about it that way. And yet PR, as we call it shorthand, is absolutely critical today to industry, to government, and to nonprofit organizations. If they don't have a public relations apparatus in place, then they're not going to be in control of how people think of them. And when we use that term public, by the way, we want to make sure that we distinguish that when we're talking about public relations, we are talking about relating to different publics. That's a term that's often used. We don't talk about audience members. We don't talk about people. We talk about publics. We have different publics. For example, ESU has many different publics. It has students. That's one public. It has the people who live off campus, who are subjected to students who might throw trash on their lawns on the way home, and also seeing students in a chipper state of mind going to class. Those are another public. We have the public of parents. We have the public of board of trustee members. We have the public of professors. A lot of different publics there. So let's move into PR. Let's talk about the origins of it, as we normally do in these classes. We start with some history, and we're going to talk about when PR started. It actually goes back to the American Revolution. The American Revolution and Thomas Paine, P-I-A-I-N-E. He was an American revolutionary that was trying to gain support for breaking away from Britain, for forming our own country. And he used public relations to do that. And he had a newsletter in which he published positive ideas about breaking away from Britain. And that newsletter was called Common Sense. Common Sense. And isn't that already a lesson in public relations, to name something after how you want your publics to believe? You want them to believe that it's common sense to break away from England. But public relations as an industry really grows out of, guess what? The Industrial Revolution. That's right, the Industrial Revolution, because as companies started to become really big, with many divisions located across many cities and in some cases many countries, the bureaucracy of these companies started to grow too, and the companies needed to realize they needed to be in more control of their imagery. And that's where public relations comes along. Some of the early origins of PR contribute to this checkered history that it has. One of the most famous strategies for public relations in the early days was by P.T. Barnum. Do you know that name? P.T. Barnum? He had a circus, Barnum and Bailey Circus. And what he used to do, the circus was traveling across the country, right? And there's no television, there's no internet. So this is a really big way that people were entertaining themselves in America in the 1800s. A circus is coming to town. And what he would do is he would write letters to the editors of newspapers where the circus was going to next. And he would write that this circus was a scam, and that the characters and the animals were not real, and that the people who were running the circus were out of control. Maybe that's not the right. He was raising a lot of doubts about the circus, so naturally what happened is people wanted to go to the circus to see if all these allegations were true. It was an ingenious form of public relations. It got more ticket sales. That's what he did. Early public relations, by the way, was one-way communication. It was one-way communication, also known as press agentry. That's the word that's used to refer to one-way communication, press agentry. This is basically about the organization sending messages to the publics, and then there's no interaction. It's just about one-way communication. It's more about building publicity, building excitement over whatever it is, your product, your service, than it is about managing an image. And we're going to see about how that comes to play a little bit more as we get into our next subject now, which is called beginnings of image management. Beginnings of image management, being in control of your image. So the first major users, I should say, of public relations as a formal part of company planning were railroads. Once again, railroads, and then later utility companies like AT&T and electric companies, and telephone companies like, I just mentioned AT&T, utility and telephone companies. Unfortunately, there was a lot of bad ethics going on. So, for example, railroads used to bribe reporters not to criticize their monopolies, and they used to bribe them by giving them cash. Here's some money for your pocket, and also free travel passes on the train, as long as the reporters stayed away from criticizing them. And in fact, the railroads also tried to engage in philanthropy. The Illinois Central Railroad funded university research on railroads, and the findings of which were printed in the press. So this is a good example of using the power of a company to get positive imagery into the regular mainstream news media, right? It's not at the point where the company's controlling their own web pages. They're just trying to control how they are portrayed by news media. AT&T, another unethical company, at least in those early days, it used to require newspapers in which it ran ads. AT&T would take ads out in newspapers. It used to require those newspapers to run positive articles about it. Otherwise, it would pull its advertising. All right, so this was the kind of way that PR was operating until we have two people who come along who are now known as the founders of PR. We're going to cover these two people. These two people are the founders of the field of public relations. And the first one is Ivy Lee. That's his name, Ivy Lee, like the plant Ivy Lee. And what he did essentially was merge two academic fields together. He merged economics and psychology. He merged these together to come up with public relations. And he was reasoning that the public will react more strongly to symbols and phrases than they will to rational arguments. And so if you ask me how I'm doing and I give you a thumbs up, that's a symbol, right? And it may have more important meaning to you than if I went into an explanation of how I'm doing. Well, I didn't sleep that well last night, and this morning I have a lot to do, and it's a sunny day. Not as impactful as this. And so that's what Ivy Lee said, that phrases and symbols are more important than long rational arguments. He also said that it's more important to put a human face on a corporation than to let that corporation remain anonymous. Because corporations, after all, are big, nameless, anonymous, faceless entities. Like Exxon. What's Exxon? It's where you get your gas, right? But as far as you know, it's a building you pull up to and put the spout put a nozzle into your car, fill up and go on it. And that's what Ivy Lee said you need to avoid. You need to have a human face there so that the company is seen as human. Ivy Lee also was the first to deal with crisis management. He was the first to deal with having a plan in place for a company so that if you do have a crisis, you know how to respond. You're not behind the eight ball. But perhaps what he did the most was he said public relations needs to be about truth-telling. Believe it or not, about truth-telling. He said to the railroads, don't hide your accidents. Don't hide your accidents by bribing reporters. If you have an accident, people are killed, don't bribe them. Instead, what you should do is invite reporters to the scene. And invite them to the scene and then help them cover the story. Then they will see they will see how hard the railroad workers work, and they will have sympathies for the railroads because you are inviting them into it. That was his strategy. In fact, Ivy Lee said, you have to tell the truth. But here's the thing. Ivy Lee didn't say you should tell the truth because it's the right thing to do. That wasn't his argument. He said tell the truth because it's more effective. Yeah, it's more effective. He said because sooner or later the public will find out anyway. That's what's happening with the January 6th insurrection, right? Sooner or later, we'll find out what actually happened because of investigations. Ivy Lee actually came up with what is known as the Declaration of Principles. Declaration of Principles, you can look that up yourself. It's in your links today. It's a bunch of principles about how public relations should operate, but basically it's saying public relations should stick to ethical principles, right? Because of its tendency to become self-promotion or advertising, like I illustrated at the beginning of class. All right, so that's Ivy Lee. Let's move on to the next person now, the next founder of public relations. It's Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays, Bernays. He is the son, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist. And in fact, he applied a lot of psychology himself. He was the first person really to apply social scientific research techniques, social scientific research techniques. That's surveying and opinion polling, all of which became much easier after World War II because of computers being able to crunch numbers and because of people being able to answer questions much easier in their leisure time. And so we have all of these surveys that are done about consumer behavior and about the president's approval ratings. That all comes out of Edward Bernays' approach to research. And he had a term for it that he used in his public relations strategies, and his term was engineering consent. Engineering consent. He said that engineering consent is where you apply scientific principles, which are really survey techniques and quantitative analysis and statistical sampling, all that stuff, to get people to support ideas. Isn't that interesting? You engineer support, right? Isn't that what politicians do? They try to engineer support for a Supreme Court justice or for a bill that's going through Congress. That's Ivy Lee. He had 2 books, by the way. He had Crystallizing Public Opinion, 1923, and he also had a book called Propaganda in 1928. Ultimately, Edward Bernays said the best way to influence people is to have messages that are delivered to them by credible sources, That's why you have Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Morgan Freeman, people who have high credibility. That's why they are spokespeople for companies. Oftentimes as a strategy for those companies' public relations because they are credible people. Now let's move on to a period of time where public relations took off in the United States after the Industrial Revolution. I'm talking about World War I, not World War II, World War I. And that was a war where the United States was extremely reluctant to get into as far as the public goes. The public opinion was very low. And so the American government established a committee called the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, to build support for the war amongst Americans. And he used it through a number of campaigns like Rosie the Riveter and Uncle Sam Wants You, pointing a finger at you. This all came about as public relations to get people to support the war. And the first people that the government went after were journalists, politicians, business people, actors, authors, teachers, in other words, opinion leaders. Back to Paul Lazarsfeld again, right? Because that's what Edward Bernays says. You got to get the information delivered by credible sources. So those people would then go and hopefully speak to the regular audience, to the regular public, I should say. Woodrow Wilson was the president at that time, and he was the first to start holding press conferences as public relations coming out of the White House. And we have press conferences today as part of the regular part of the way that the White House interacts with the public. Now, when did PR become a profession? When did it have a field of study as part of the expectations of somebody going through public relations? Well, that happened in the 1940s and the 1950s when universities started offering degrees in public relations. And in fact, our university and our department, the Department of Communication, has a concentration called Public Relations. It's our second largest concentration. It actually has a club associated with it called the PRSSA, the Public Relations Student Society of America, PRSSA. They're actually an incorporated firm. They're not just a student organization. They're an incorporated firm. They bring in an outside public relations specialist from Harrisburg, from Philadelphia, from New York. They put our students in contact with graduates of our program who are now well networked in the field. They are PR specialists. And then they also do pro bono work for the community, which is free work for the community. So this is very typical of departments across the United States, academic departments, the formal study of public relations to keep it ethical and to provide our students with the very best strategies for succeeding in this field. And so PR became a profession in the 1940s. It was aided, by the way, by television also developing to swing back to the development of a mass medium. TV came on the scene in the 50s, and now companies could use television, this medium that is in every American's family room, to manage their imagery. And there was a lot of contention in the 1960s because of television in the Vietnam War era. Vietnam War was an awful war. It wasn't even declared war. Not that there could be a good war, but this was a particularly awful war because it wasn't even a declared war. It was a conflict, and most Americans didn't know why so many Americans were going to this obscure country, and so many young Americans were losing their lives. And so as a result, there were a lot of protests in the United States, and gas bombs and a lot of violence to protest our involvement in the war, and television showcased all of this, and it created a lot of problems of PR for the government in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now let's move to the business of public relations, talk about it as a full-fledged business. In public relations, any business is involved in public relations, and many companies have their own PR departments. Others hire PR firms. Certainly there is a PR function no matter how big your business is, even if you only have 1 or 2 employees. And so what goes on? There are 3 functions that go on. One function of public relations in your company is going to be informing, and that is sending out a variety of information to publics. Anytime there's a campus safety issue, for example, our university will release information that's by the police that's available to the public. That's informing the publics. Persuading is a second function. Persuading is about attempting to bring publics to change their attitudes and their opinions. That's what happened with the marijuana campaign to legalize marijuana. It happened with alcohol before that. It happened with gay marriage. Often you have to start out with a campaign to convince the public that something needs changing. And then the third function is integrating. Integrating is where you bring the publics and the institutions together through shared goals. Bring the publics and the institutions together through shared goals. So East Stroudsburg University for many years used to run what was called a Big Brothers, Big Sisters telethon. Do you know about that? The Big Brothers, Big Sisters organization, to find a big brother or big sister, or somebody to spend time with somebody who doesn't have a big brother or big sister, or maybe even a father or mother. And that is something that the community is interested in. We certainly have lots of young people in that position around the university. And so the university holds a telethon to bring the public of people who are interested in finding homes or finding companionship for young people, bring those people together with university people who have goals of helping people. And it's an example of integrating, right? It's bringing publics and institutions together through shared goals. Edward Bernays is instructive here because he said that a two-way model of public relations is necessary, not the one-way model that Ivy Lee talked about, the two-way model. And that's made even more possible today by the internet because you can interact directly with your publics, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Edward Bernays, though, he actually said that PR is a public good. It's actually needed for society. It's needed for the proper functioning of society, and that's how he tried to resurrect the ethics of public relations. Let's talk about the PR process now. What generally happens when you hire a PR firm? Well, there's 5 things that they go through normally. One is research. They're going to research the problems or the issues facing your organization. Then secondly, they're going to set some objectives. What would you like to do? You want to repair your image? You want to get people to think differently about your product? You want to bring in new audience members, new publics to be interested in your product, your service, whatever it is that you're offering? What are the objectives? That's what comes next. Then comes programming. Programming is planning activities to carry out the objectives. What are you going to do as an organization to try and carry out the objectives to change or reinforce the imagery that you are trying to achieve? And then comes evaluation. Evaluation is testing the messages once you've sent them out, making sure that they are the messages that you want to continue to send out. ESU, for example, is sending out a letter to students who have not yet registered. And one of the messages in that letter was, Some courses are being canceled. If you want to get a course, make sure you register now. And several of us said, no, this is a terrible message. We don't want to send a message that our courses are being canceled. So we're evaluating that message. And no, we need to be more positive. We need to say that now there are still courses open. And that's different. We did that through an evaluation process. We changed that letter before that letter went out. And then the final step in the PR process is stewardship. Stewardship is maintaining those relationships that you've created through the previous steps. Just because things are pretty good between ESU and the surrounding community right now doesn't mean things that can go terribly wrong. There was a murder at ESU a few years ago on the campus. It wasn't committed by ESU people, but that was a terrible nightmare. Well, obviously for the people involved, and by the way, the 3 people involved were just sentenced to many years in prison, but it also was terrible for ESU in terms of maintaining relationships that had previously been good between our campus and that part of campus where the murder took place. Now, when we talk about publics, we are talking about 2 different kinds of publics. Let's talk about 2 types of publics. Now, we've got internal publics. Those are those publics that are associated with the internal organization of a company or a person or a movement, all the internal people. So for ESU, that's going to be students, faculty, it's going to be administrators, it's going to be anybody who works at ESU, right? Those are the internal publics. But then we also have external publics. Those are the people who are associated with the parents, they're external. The news media around here, they're external. The Chamber of Commerce, they're external. People in town, they're external. So that's how public relations professionals initially start to look at publics when they're trying to figure out how to serve them. Let's move on to crisis communication. Now, nothing tests communication like crisis. Really, nothing tests an organization's ability to handle PR like a crisis. You know, whether it's a product that has suddenly poisoned somebody, or if you're an oil company, you've got a leaky well. Or if you're a company that has an outbreak of the pandemic and you didn't have mask wearing practicing going on, you always have to be prepared for a crisis. And in fact, in our graduate program, our communication department has a graduate program. We're teaching a class in that next semester called Communication Context, Strategic Crisis Communication. That's how important a feature it is in our PR curriculum. So there are five basic strategies you have to have in place. Ivy Lee was the one who got this conversation started. First is to be prepared. That means have a crisis plan before the crisis happens. Every airline right now has a crisis plan in place should one of their planes go down. They already have it ready to go. Secondly, be honest. Cover-ups are worse than the problems themselves. Thirdly, apologize. And don't just apologize, mean it. Don't come off as sounding like you don't really mean it. Apologize and mean it. Thirdly, move quickly to respond to the crisis. And really today that means almost instantly because of the web and the internet and people able to jump on social media and find out information on their own. You got to be ahead of the curve. And so you really have no time. You can't sit there in a boardroom and try and formulate your strategy. You got to get out there in front of a story. And then lastly, communicate with the press and other institutions. That means your own employees, that means your stockholders, that means government regulators if they're involved, and that means your customers, of course. Now let's move to discussing PR and the implications of it when it went online with computers and the World Wide Web. And so that happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, not too long ago. And for the first time, online media presented a new information channel for public relations. You could go directly to the people. You didn't have to go through a radio station. You didn't have to go through an advertising campaign. You go directly to people. And you can use your own website to research your publics. And all of a sudden you have tools that will let you see what publics are saying about your company. You can monitor social media without even doing surveys, and you can get information. And so, but that also means that you have a need to manage your social media. ESU manages its social media. The Department of Communication cannot send out a message on social media unless it goes through our Department of University Relations here at ESU. That's all about managing social media in a new age because situations can go viral. McDonald's can have a sandwich that can go viral as being, poisonous or toxic or not what it looks like a dead shoe or whatever. That can happen on social media in a heartbeat. So you need to have a plan in place to deal with that. Now let's talk about PR and society. PR and society, we're going to start with the sociologists David Alteid here and Robert Snow, the sociologists, I should say. And they did some research that showed that, believe it or not, if you look at news stories on TV news and listen to radio news and read newspaper news, would you believe that 40 to 90% of those stories start out as PR press releases? 40 to 90%. So what happens is a company, let's take a company like Gillette Razors. Okay, they make razors. Let's say they've manufactured a new razor that they're going to claim has a sharper edge and lasts longer. I mean, they're always doing that, right? It's a razor company. Of course they're going to do that. And so they're going to put together a press release and they're going to send it out to radio and TV stations that are going to say a new technology is available using a Teflon heating point, which makes it easier to cut through whiskers, or however they're going to say it. And so they're sending it out as news, right? And the news organization, the radio station, the TV station, they're sitting there saying, we need news today. Oh, look at this. Here's a story. That's what happens. Now, not all advertisements, if you want to think of them that way, make their way into news, but this is a typical way that it happens. That's why 40 to 90% of the news is starting out as press releases, because media are looking for news stories. Let's talk about PR and political activism now. PR can be a very effective arm of effecting political change. I mentioned gay marriage and legalization of marijuana. What's going to be the next law that's been on the books for so long that it's going to fall? It's PR that's responsible for that. It's for political activism. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. Those have been very successful because the people in charge of the PR, that BLM with a hashtag and the Me Too with a hashtag, that's ingenious to get that passed around on the internet and raise awareness. That's what PR is capable of in terms of political activism. And now we're going to finish out with an extension of that, and that's PR and civil rights. Martin Luther King, a hero in our country for civil rights, showing us how to restore or try to restore equality without violence, doing it in a pacified way. Martin Luther King was in Alabama, you know about that, and he was involved in protests and marches there. And then there was a racist police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor was his name, and this story was covered by the New York Times and the New York Post. And Martin Luther King, with his protest, was anticipating that he was going to get put in jail, and he did. And what he did was he wrote letters from the jail as part of his public relations. And then when he was released from jail, as he knew that he would, he invited children into the protests, and that gave riveting images because the TV cameras were covering children, showing these young innocent people involved in peaceful protests. And so even though there was rioting and King's brother's house was burned down, the campaign was ultimately successful because people took down the white signs and the colored signs indicating where black people could not go. They took them down from the restrooms and the drinking fountains. And finally, African Americans were allowed to sit at lunch counters and ride the buses in Alabama. So PR can be much more than just changing society for the good. It can restore and encourage and create fundamental human rights if used appropriately. And it just shows that it has a proper place in our society. Have a great day.